They say the squeaky wheel gets some grease, right?
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
Newly elected Senator Sam Bell is here for this evening. He was here only just a couple of weeks ago as we talked about his election to the Senate. I wouldn't say he surprised people, but he certainly drew fellow senators into a, well, maybe not literal, but certainly close to figurative fetal position when he made some remarks on the Senate floor on opening day. Not customary, but gutsy. Whether you subscribe to the comments or not, if you're scoring on the 10-point must scoring system for courage, if you know the culture and the place like I do and like the senators do and those who follow the state government do, you know that that was like hoo-hoo-hoo. So we'll talk to him about the hoo-hoo-hoo tonight. Welcome aboard. Nice to have you in. Couple of things. We got a shutdown, FYI, in case you were scoring at home. Here's one of our headlines on it. Of course, depends on who's counting, but it's second or third largest shutdown or longest shutdown in the business. And, you know, this morning we saw things like the TSA doing a sick-in call. We've got a headline on that, right, Eric? Sure we do. There we go. Airport security lines grow across the nation. And now we're starting to see the emotion of federal employees who are without a paycheck or due one and didn't get one and having trouble with cash flow and all that kind of a thing. And you know, the president more or less has suggested that those people are with him. You know, they're all into this whole spiritual thing together. That all federal employees understand his mission for the wall, and of course, is the basis for the shutdown. I'm not certain that's ever been the case, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see over the next week or two what the pressure looks like and where it comes from, causing who to, I don't know, cry uncle first. The thing is, we really don't have a definitive thing in the middle that we're arguing over. The wall, $5.8 billion. Past that, it's really kind of hard to figure out exactly what the expenditure is going to be. Is it steel? Is it concrete? By the way, steel's 3 times the price, but we're going to save money using it? How does that work? Today, Senators Whitehouse and Reid had a press conference at Senator Reid's office that I attended, and here's just some of what Senator Reid had to say.
Even if the president was serious about building a wall, he would have sent to us plans, proposals, land acquisitions that were necessary. None of this has been planned. This is just a whimsical demand that he fulfill a campaign promise at the expense of the American people.
So somewhere along the line, though, the Democrats are probably going to have to be in a position where they say, look, this is what, like, help me help you. This is what we're going to have to accept, or this is what we will accept in order to be able to move this conversation on border security across, because the president seems inept to do it. He makes an offer, his people go down the hallway to try to articulate the offer, and then he reneges by the time they get down the hallway. So it's going to be an interesting week on this whole thing. We'll keep close attention to it, or pay close attention to it, of course. Let's come home and talk about this issue that is on the board today. Of course, the Senate got together, and we have leadership renewed, and Mattiello and Ruggerio, with not too much confusion or debate, were reelected to their Speaker and Senate President post. But as I told you, our guest this evening, newly elected, stood up and, well, put his flag in the ground.
On issue after issue, Senator Ruggerio does not support many of the core principles of the Democratic Party, instead taking policy positions typically associated with the Republican Party nationally. He opposes repealing the tax cuts for the rich. He has taken thousands of dollars from the NRA. He's endorsed by Right to Life and is not pro-choice.
Now, look, I thought that was welcome, by the way. All you had to do is make a speech, and you're right back. Congratulations on your election, and a Happy New Year. That particular part of the speech, still in the gutsy category, was on the issues. I mean, you just happened to disagree with the, I don't know, brand of Democrat that Senator President Rosario is, correct?
Yeah, and you know, the other issue I think it's really important, it's important to me personally as a bisexual man, is his position on marriage equality. You know, he voted against it, and I really believe that we should have a Senate president who supports marriage equality and supports broader equality measures for the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, you mentioned that in your speech too. I think a lot of us are caught off guard, even those of us who are, you know, still, we have our jaws knocked back by the conversation from time to time, you know, but still want that equality. That's where I am. I mean, I'm not going to pretend, oh, as a bisexual man. I don't hear that a lot on the program. People don't talk about their orientation on the program, let alone their orientation on a speech on the floor to nominate the Senate president. Tell me, well, since you brought it up, I wasn't going to, but since you brought it up, why is that perspective, A, need to be articulated, and what's in your head and your heart on that? What are you trying to accomplish?
Well, you know, it is a personal thing. I mean, yeah, it is true that my district has a lot of LGBTQ people, and it's important for me to represent that part of my community. But, you know, it's also important to me personally. For me, you know, what I saw the marriage equality movement do was really turn around our whole society's view and really achieve acceptance that would have never been there if it weren't for that movement. And, you know, for me personally, it made me comfortable being openly bisexual, and it made my life a lot better. It was a really personal thing for me. And I think it's also concerning that not only Senator Ruggiero holds these views, but Michael McCaffrey, who is the number 2, also holds these views and is still quite adamant about them. And I imagine, I don't want to speak for Senator Nesselbush, but I imagine that, you know, I know it was her bill, and she's married to a woman, and I know that that's important to her. And I think it's that, for people in the LGBTQ community, that issue still matters, and it's still really personal. And when you're personally affected by things, it's really important. So I think it's important to have people who are affected by these kinds of policies, so that we can have people who advocate for LGBTQ equality.
They may have voted against, but we've changed the law.
We've changed the law, but we still have a lot of work to do on equality for the trans and gender nonconforming communities here in Rhode Island. So it's not like, you know, this issue is done. And, you know, we're under threat of backsliding on a lot of issues. I mean, right now there's a real possibility that abortion rights could be severely curtailed here in Rhode Island, which was something that we thought for decades was a done deal, was a won and settled right. But now, you know, there are still people out there who want to roll the clock back, and it's really concerning to have someone like that in the position of Senate President.
I didn't follow the connection, although unless you want to treat this as a progressive package, I don't see the connection between abortion rights and LGBTQ rights.
Well, they're core principles of the Democratic Party. You know, as is gun control, as is economic policy. You know, repealing the tax cuts for the rich, I think, is really, really important. These are core principles of the Democratic Party. And my point was that, you know, I'm a Democrat. I represent a very Democratic district. For me to represent a Democratic district, I need to vote for someone who has the policy principles of the Democratic Party. It's
really fascinating what's going on in our politics right now, because to your I could say to your credit, I don't. There are parts of your package, so to speak, that I empathize and or agree with, and there are others that I don't. You know, the Democratic Party back in my day, you know, Kennedy stood as the titular figure, right? My mom, Irish Catholic, pro-life, socially conservative, economically liberal Democrat. Mm-hmm. I think that, you know, Mattiello and Ruggiero still fit that bill.
I totally disagree. Absolutely. I mean, look, they're very conservative. They're more conservative on economic issues than social issues. Their economic positions are much further to the right than their social issue positions.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you would say that. And you know what? It's one of these things that we can go get a coffee or a beer and go all night on this, because I guess when I hear about, you know, abortion, the Democratic Party's positions, there is still a constituency. I agree, by the way. The President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House have filled the vacuum of not having Republican conservative fiscal mindset in the state. They have been stronger on taxation, more conservative, if you will, on taxation issues than that original description that I made. Having said that, they stand as kind of an old guard of Democratic politics as is understood by many in the state. And you brazenly define Democratic policy as something completely different. And so it's going to be an interesting run. This is all part of this progressive movement on our current General Assembly. The theme of today's show, though, is it took rocks for you to stand up and not go through the motions. And when we come back, we're out of time in the segment, when we come back, we'll talk about that, because whether you agree with the senator or not, that's just not done around here. We'll be right back.
So to close, I want to stress that I understand that what I'm doing today is something that typically just isn't done. I understand that my vote today breaks a norm, a new norm, but a powerful one all the same. I know that most of my colleagues will not make the same decision as I have, but I am asking them to understand. I'm asking them to understand why I must cast my ballot against Senator Ruggerio today.
Now, that was the final moment of what was about a 7 or 8 minute presentation that Senator Bell, newly elected to the state Senate, made in opposition of the nomination for Senate President Ruggerio to continue in that post. He and Donald Nesselbush from Pawtucket were the only no votes on Senator Ruggerio. She was here 2 or 3 weeks ago talking about this process of voting and whether the vote ought to be concealed so that people could vote without worrying about their backs. Well, you agree with that position. You and she advocated for that. She did not make a speech on the floor.
She did, yeah,
well,
she made a floor speech.
Not nearly as compelling, correct? Did I miss that?
I mean, look, I thought her speech, she gave a really great speech. I thought it was pretty compelling.
I think check that. So I didn't see that part of it, so sometimes even the Dan York State of Mind show misses something, but we'll review that and make commentary on that tomorrow, because I hate to make a mistake. But the point is that your speech got all the attention. Your speech was perceived as the one that was like, Smash Mouth football, rock'em sock'em robots. In fact, you actually, to your credit, I think, previewed the speech with the Senate President in some way, shape, or form, and he asked you to make a concession on some of the past behavioral issues that you listed?
Right, and one of the really tricky things for me is that one of the main reasons why I couldn't support Senate President has to do with ethics. And the details of his history are pretty lurid and graphic. And I understand why he didn't want me to go into the details on the Senate floor in front of his grandchildren. And I was happy to agree to not go into any of the specifics on the Senate floor.
How did that gentleman's agreement come to be? Did you preview to him
what
you
you
were going to say?
Yeah, so he finally met with me. It took a long time to get him to agree to meet with me. Refused to initially, but eventually he finally met with me the day before, which I give him a lot of credit for. Eventually meeting, especially I give a lot of credit to the Chief of Staff, Stephen Iannazi, for making that finally happen. And he met with me, and I was willing to agree to that, because I thought it's important for me to be polite about how I bring up these concerns.
Because you told him what? Listen,
the ethics issues are serious.
You told him what? You were going to play a little smash mouth football, and he asked you to tone it down for the day. Is that what happened?
Yeah, he made a request, and I thought it was reasonable. I didn't want to go into, and it's also, it's very important at the same time as raising these concerns to be polite about it, because they are, in nature, really, really pretty graphic. And the specifics are pretty difficult to discuss on the Senate floor because they're just so extreme. And that is part of why it's so important to me to not vote for him, because the details are really tough. It's really hard for me to understand.
Okay, so I don't have
you can brush these ethics issues aside.
I got you. Give me, without going into the details, not because we're you're wary of them, but I want to be able to do my own diligence. I know that you've put out some paperwork that has been sent to us on attachments and exhibits, so to speak, on things that you're referring to. Are you building a case? And what are the categories of behavior that you have a problem with in terms of the Senate President and his history? Just give me, without the details. The subject matters are?
Vandalism. I have a problem with vandalism. I think vandalism is wrong. I have a problem with theft.
Wait a second. How could you say that vandalism is wrong?
And look, there was the issue with the DUI, and I don't think that's right. But for me, the concerning thread that runs through all of this is about use of political power and how someone avoids getting in trouble gets benefits that they wouldn't otherwise have because of political reasons. And I think that also really ties into the mortgage scandal, that people get benefits that just aren't afforded to other people without political power. And it's that use of political power, the way that these issues interface with the political system, that is, to me, the most concerning.
All right, so it leaves you wanting, as a viewer, so what about those things? We'll do our work here to review the documents that Sam has put forth into the public domain to discuss these. Most of the things that you've put through and have put out there are documentable, traceable, historical. A lot of it's news clippings. I mean, but when you bring it all together, it paints a pretty tough picture. The Senate President, who in many ways is kind of perceived, I think, politically as my grandfather was, which was he had a pretty torrid past, but when I was born, everything seemed to be pretty much okay, and he was pretty well understood to be the good guy. I'm just looking for an analogy, but you know what I'm saying. There's a kind of, that's yesterday, this is today type of thing.
6 years ago wasn't that long ago, right? The most recent incident was about 6 years ago. And so these things have been going on. Yeah, it stretches out over a 40-year career, but it's not like, it was all at the beginning of that career. Right. And I think that the real answer against this has often been we don't talk about it. It's not that anyone excuses it or says it's okay. It's just that they say we don't talk about this. And that's a big part of the problem with ethics in Rhode Island, is that within the State House bubble, the very strong unwritten rule is that you never discuss these things. And that's how people are able to get away with it. And that culture, I think, encourages malfeasance on the part of legislators, and it's really problematic.
All right, so I had asked on the radio last week after listening to Sam's speech, it was a hypothetical type of question, more rhetorical, or just kind of open-ended, and that is he going to be a couple of month flame-out or a one-man cult figure in this state? We'll see what his answer is when we come back.
On issue after issue, Senator Ruggerio does not support many of the core principles of the Democratic Party, instead taking policy positions typically associated with the Republican Party nationally. He opposes repealing the tax cuts for the rich. He has taken thousands of dollars from the NRA. He's endorsed by Right to Life and is not pro-choice.
Again, it's not often that I repeat video, but we made some edits, and it's important for you just to remind yourself, especially if you just tuned in, that was a pretty gutsy speech on Inauguration Day and Nomination Day for the Senate President. Normally, perfunctory efforts still came out that way, but your speech being what it is. Look, you're an interesting cat. I've always kind of admired your articulate skills, and I didn't know that I was going to use the word courage until after that day. I give you a lot of credit. I know what the gravitational inertia is like against standing up and doing something like that. It's uncanny, and it's not something that you see around here. And I'm sure the Senate President not too happy that I'm suggesting that, but you know what? You got to see it the way it is. Here's what I'm wondering. Have you figured out and navigated the line between that which will be standing up and almost appearing political jockish in nature and working to get some of the stuff that you really believe in through? Because you're so open now with your criticism, any kind of lash out by the Senate President will be obvious. Yet, you can render yourself useless because you're radioactive and nobody wants to talk to you. So talk to me about that. I only have a couple minutes.
Yeah, so
you know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about, and this is one of the arguments that people sometimes use. You know, they say you'll never get anything done. The Senate president will just punish you. To his credit, he has said that he won't do that, and I take him at his word. And you know, I think that it's hard. There are two arguments people sometimes make. One, that you'll be so punished, and that's just there's this culture of retribution that you can't get away with it, so don't even try. The other argument people make is that it's run in such an open way that you have to support him even if you disagree with his issue positions. And both arguments cannot be true at the same time. So I think that there's a little bit of a contradiction there. And I really do believe, look, I take the Senate president at his word. And I think it's insulting to him when people who support him say you have to support him because he'll punish you otherwise. And I really think that's insulting to him. And I take him at his word, and I think that, you know, he does run the Senate in a more open fashion than the House is run, and I commended him for that in my speech. And that has not been, you know, the focus of my criticism. I'm looking forward to working with him on policy areas where we agree.
Was it a one-time stand to make your case and establish who you are and why you couldn't vote for him, or will you continue to hit him? Those exhibits I refer to, are you going to continue to use them? Are you going to look for his ouster, or are you just going to try to settle in here now? What is your thought?
You know, I think to some degree, my criticism is more of the conservative leadership and the broader group of people involved, not just him specifically. So I have many concerns with Michael McCaffrey as well. I also didn't vote for him in the caucus vote. So I'm not looking to replace Ruggiero with McCaffrey. I'm looking to make a really much more systemic change in how the Rhode Island State Senate works.
That's going to take you a couple of years, granted.
Well, we do have elections every 2 years. It's one of the great things about living in a democracy. And I hope to be able to make the case. I think it takes time to make a case to really change the way things are done and change the way people talk about things and look at things. But one of the things I think that's really important is, in order to show that you're going to lose so much by not supporting the Senate president actually has to go out and pass some of the bills of a lot of the more traditional Democratic liberal senators whose bills he hasn't really been passing. So if he wants to go show that there's something to lose, he has to go out and pass those bills this year. And that, I think, will be really interesting to see whether that happens.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see. It will be very interesting to see how you thread this needle. So far, well threaded.
Well, thank you so much.
We shall keep score. By the way, I said on the radio the other day that he's got an evil look. It was fun. It was you got this little troublemaking look in your eyes sometimes, which tells me that you know, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. By the way, it was complimentary in a sense. You know what I'm talking about? No, that's all right. But we'll see whether good or evil prevails over the next 2 years with State Senator Sam Bell. Final thought on this much next. The old adage that it's a game of inches, whatever game you're playing. How about this one? Cody Parkey kicks that field goal. That's his reaction. We don't have the video by rights, we can't use it. But it hits the left goalpost and then the crossbar. And if it hit the crossbar with the football in another angle, it would have fell in rather than falling out. That's an entire season in a playoff game lost on centimeters, never mind inches. Proves the cliche, right? We're going to talk about General Assembly rules with the Common Cause director tomorrow night. See you on the radio at 3 on WPRO. Good night.